I returned for Christmas. I found my daughter sat alone with no gifts. A note from my mother-in-law. We're celebrating without her in the Bahamas. She's your burden. She wasn't crying. She looked at me and said, Dad, while they were packing, I found something in Grandpa's office. They don't know I have it. She handed it to me. I saw it and laughed. I made a call. They had no idea what was waiting for them when they came back. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Trent Holloway had been awake for 22 hours straight when he crossed the Montana state line. The truck's heater rattled low and steady, pushing out warm air that smelled faintly of oil and stale coffee. Outside, the world was nothing but white. Snow had pressed down on the fields, packed tight along the highway shoulders, and turned the roadside pines into heavy gray shapes half dissolved in the dark. A reflective sign swept through the headlights and disappeared behind him. Bozeman, 41 miles. He rolled his neck, heard it crack, pressed a little harder on the gas. 6 weeks in North Dakota. 6 weeks of frozen ground and cracked knuckles and pipeline work that had no patience for tired. The kind of job that stripped everything down to function. Wake up, eat, work, sleep, repeat, until you stopped thinking in terms of weeks or weather and just thought in terms of what still needed doing. He had missed Thanksgiving. He had missed 2 of Macy's school events, a reading performance and a science fair. Both times, she had called him that evening and described it in careful detail, giving him each piece like she was working to make sure the distance didn't take too much from him. He had listened and laughed in the right places, and each time he hung up, he had sat for a minute in the bunk room silence with a kind of ache that never got easier to carry and that he had never once talked about out loud. But the job had closed 3 days ahead of schedule. The crew had been solid. The weather had cooperated during the final stretch, and Trent had been on the road before noon without calling ahead. He had made the decision somewhere around the Nebraska border. A surprise was worth more right now than a phone call. He wanted to see her face before she had time to prepare it. He had pictured it the whole drive down. Macy hearing the truck crunch into the driveway. The front doors swinging wide before he even killed the engine. Her running out in her socks, not stopping for shoes, not stopping for a jacket, not stopping for anything, arms already out before she hit the porch steps. And Lauren in the doorway behind her, backlit and warm, shaking her head in that way she had when she was pretending to be exasperated but wasn't. The living room light golden through the curtains. He had driven the last 4 hours on that image. It was the kind of thinking that had kept him going through the whole 6 weeks. The kind of mental anchor a person creates when the work is hard and the distance is real and there's nothing to hold onto except the fact that there's something good waiting at the end of it. He was not a man who needed much. He had proven that across years of field work, of camps and temporary housing and meals eaten standing up in the cold. But Macy was the exception to his general self-sufficiency, the one thing he needed the way you need water rather than the way you need coffee. The work was survivable without her. Everything else was survivable without her. But he had not had a single full night of sleep in 6 weeks. And the reason, if he was honest about it, was her. The marriage was something else entirely. He had stopped lying to himself about that sometime around the 2nd year of the pipeline contracts. The quiet, steady recognition that what he came home to was less and less the thing he had married, and that the drift was not entirely explained by absence. Patricia had been in his house and in his marriage since the beginning, always at the edge of things, always shaping Lauren's responses in ways that were hard to name directly, but unmistakable in their cumulative effect. He had chosen his battles carefully over the years, which meant he had chosen to lose many of them quietly. He had told himself that was maturity, that it was pragmatic, that the marriage could absorb these accommodations and still remain fundamentally sound. He had been wrong about that. And somewhere in the last year, he had started to understand just how wrong. He turned onto their street just after 9 in the evening. The neighborhood was quiet in the specific way of a block after fresh snow. Sounds absorbed, edges softened. Every porch light burning amber through the hanging icicles. A neighbor 2 houses down had left a Christmas wreath on their door since before he left. Still there, faded at the edges, patient. He slowed, and pulled into the driveway. The house was dark, not the dark of people who have gone to bed early and let the room settle. A different kind of dark, something closed and withdrawn, the darkness of a place that has not been occupied in days. No light around the curtains. No flicker from the television. Even the small lamp Lauren kept burning on the side table in the living room, the one she called her way home light, a habit she had kept for the full 11 years of their marriage, was off. Trent sat with the engine ticking as it cooled. He looked at the front door. He told himself it was fine. They had probably gone to bed early. The lamp bulb had probably burned out. He reached for his bag on the passenger seat. His boots hit the driveway and sank into 3 inches of undisturbed snow. Clean surface. Not a single tire track coming in. Not a single footprint going out. The snow was not fresh. The surface had started to crust, and the edges of the flakes had merged into each other in the way that took at least a day, maybe 2. He stopped walking. He stood there in the dark and the cold with his bag in his hand and looked at his own front door, and the image he had been driving toward for 4 hours dissolved quietly, without drama. He put one foot in front of the other and moved toward the house. The front door was unlocked. A low current moved through him that he did not let reach his face. Lauren always locked that door. It was a habit pressed in her by years of her mother's consistent voice, Patricia's particular brand of caution that touched every small decision in the household like a thumb pressing a thumbtack home, whether or not the thumbtack needed pressing. The door being unlocked meant either something was wrong or nobody had thought about it on the way out. He was not sure which one troubled him more. He pushed the door open and stepped inside and stopped moving. Cold. Not surface cold. Not the kind that builds up overnight when the heat gets turned low. This was a deeper cold. The cold that accumulates over days when a house sits without movement, without cooking, without anyone running the taps or opening doors. The kind of cold that works its way into the walls. He could see his breath for just a moment before the air around him slowly equalized. He stood still, listened. Nothing. No television. No footsteps. No hum of daily occupation. And then, from the living room, small and careful, "I'm here, Dad." He moved toward it. She was on the couch, tucked under the decorative throw, the white and gray one Lauren had bought, because it looked good draped over the armrest and photographed well, the kind of blanket meant for aesthetics rather than actual warmth. Macy had her knees pulled up to her chest and her hands folded in her lap. The room was almost dark except for the pale ambient light filtering in through the snow-covered windows. She looked at him when he came through the doorway, and she was not frightened and she was not crying. She looked at him the way someone looks at a person they have been waiting for, not desperately, but with relief, the specific relief of a child who has been managing something alone and can now stop. That expression on an 8-year-old's face was the most disturbing thing he had ever seen in his life. Not because it was hysterical, because it was composed. He crossed the room in 3 steps and crouched down in front of her. He put his hands on her knees and looked at her face in the faint light. Her cheeks, her lips, the color in her eyes. "Hey." He kept his voice low and even. "Talk to me. Where is everyone?" "They went on a trip," she said. She said it the way she might have said it was cold outside, or that school started at 8. A fact. Just a fact. What trip? Where did they go? The Bahamas. She shifted slightly under the blanket and looked down at her hands. "Grandma said I just slow them down." He stayed crouched there for a moment, holding that sentence in his chest. Then he stood up and walked to the kitchen. He turned on the light and opened the refrigerator. A jar of mustard. 2 soda cans. A box of baking soda that had been in there since before he left. He closed it, opened the pantry. A cereal box on its side, light enough when he lifted it to have almost nothing in it. A single can of chicken broth. A row of spices that no child would ever open on her own. He stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment. He was not a man who needed to pace or move when he was thinking. He stood still and let the full shape of the situation settle over him the way cold air settles into a space. Evenly, completely, without drama. He had walked into this house expecting warmth and found a cold, dark room and a child who had been rationing cereal for 2 days. His wife had left a note on the counter in her slanted handwriting that communicated, with its breezy brevity, Not just what she had done, but how she had thought about doing it. As an inconvenience managed, not a failure to account for. On the counter beside the empty fruit bowl, there was a note. Torn from the small notepad they kept near the phone, written in Lauren's looping, slightly slanted handwriting. The kind of handwriting you use when you're writing something standing up, not sitting down, not giving it much time. We needed a break. Macy's fine. You'll be back soon anyway. Lauren, he read it once. Then he read it again, slowly. Then he set it back down on the counter, very carefully, and he stood there with his hands braced lightly on the edge of the counter, and he looked at the wall. He heard Patricia in every word of it. He had been hearing Patricia in Lauren's decisions for years. Her logic, her framing, her particular gift for presenting other people's needs as responsibilities those people had already pre-agreed to carry. Patricia Doone had spent her entire adult life deciding what was necessary and then informing everyone around her of the decision after the fact, with the serene confidence of someone who has never been seriously held accountable for the gap between what she said and what actually happened. Lauren had grown up inside that system and had come call it good judgment. He had tried, in the early years, to name what he was seeing, to point at the specific mechanism of it, the way a decision would be made before he was ever consulted, the way Lauren would present it to him as something already settled, the way any pushback on his part became, in the retelling, evidence that he was difficult rather than evidence that he had a reasonable point. He had been patient because he had loved Lauren, and because he had believed for a long time that patience was the appropriate response to something that was habitual rather than malicious. He had thought the marriage would create its own gravity, eventually, strong enough to draw Lauren free of Patricia's orbit. He had been wrong about that. The orbit had only tightened, and now it had produced this, a note in slanted handwriting in a cold house and a child who had been surviving on water for a day because she did not want to be a problem. He walked back to the living room and sat on the edge of the coffee table, facing Macy. When did they leave? He asked. 3 days ago. She was watching him with steady eyes. What did you eat? She pulled the blanket a little tighter and looked at it. There was cereal. I had that for 2 days. I tried to make it last. She paused. Then it ran out. Then what? Water. She said it simply, without complaint. The way she said it was what hit him hardest. The matter-of-factness of it. The absence of self-pity. I didn't want to call anyone. I didn't want to make trouble for anyone. He sat very still for a moment. He was aware of something happening in him that was not like anger, though it was born from the same place anger came from. It was quieter, more final. The feeling of a load-bearing wall that has been quietly undermined for years suddenly going solid. Not cracking, not breaking outward, just resolving into a new permanent form. A door swinging shut at a depth he wouldn't fully measure for days, maybe weeks. He reached out and placed one hand gently on the side of her face. Her skin was cool, not dangerously cold, but the cool of a child who has been surviving on inadequate warmth for several days. You are not going to have to do that again, he said. She looked at him. He held her gaze. I promise you that, he said. She believed him. He could see it happen, a small, invisible release of something she had been holding. She had not cried once since he walked in. She had not asked him for a single thing. She had just waited with the patience of someone who had decided to trust the waiting, and now she could stop. He tucked the blanket properly around her, stood up, and went to check every room in the house. He made eggs, found 3 at the back of the fridge, a last half stick of butter wedged in the door. He scrambled them slowly and properly, not rushing, not letting his mind pull him away from what his hands were doing, and toasted the last 2 slices of bread and poured her a glass of water from the filter on the tap. He set it all in front of her at the kitchen table and sat across from her and watched her eat. She ate steadily and without fuss, the way she ate most things. She had always been a child who didn't perform her feelings at the table. She ate what was in front of her and thought whatever she was thinking and occasionally reported on it when she was ready. About halfway through the plate, she looked up at him with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for the exact right moment to say something. Dad, I found something. He waited. While they were packing in Grandpa's office, she said. Before they left, they were in there a long time. Boxes and stuff. I went in after they drove away because I wanted something to read. There are a lot of books in there, and nobody ever cares when I take one. Walter Dune had been a careful and private man. He had built his money over decades, the way men of his generation often did, quietly without broadcasting, through a combination of land investment, rental properties, and managed accounts that he had tended with the same steady, undemonstrative attention he brought to everything. 3 counties worth of holdings. Properties in Bozeman and Missoula. Numbers that the people around him had consistently underestimated, because Walter had never found it useful to let anyone know exactly what he was worth. He had died 2 years ago of a heart attack on an ordinary Tuesday in October. Patricia had assumed control of the estate within days, moving through the legal machinery of it with a brisk, organized competence that everyone around her had interpreted as grief management, as strength, as a natural extension of a woman who had spent 4 decades running a household and simply applied those same skills to a larger task. No one had looked closely. There had been no reason to look closely. Macy led him down the hallway after she finished eating. Walter's office was a room that had always carried a particular atmosphere, formal and still, smelling of old paper and the faint residue of pipe tobacco that had soaked into the furniture years before Walter gave it up. The shelves were lined with binders, reference books, and the kind of organized filing system that belonged to a man who trusted paper more than memory. Some of the file drawers were open. 2 cardboard boxes near the window had been moved and res-tacked without much care, as if someone had been sorting through them in a hurry and had not bothered to make it tidy. Macy pointed to the desk. Wedged partially under the edge of the desk blotter, almost flush with the surface, was a thick manila envelope. Nothing written on it. No label. "I think they forgot it," Macy said quietly. Or maybe they didn't see it. It was under the corner. Trent picked it up. Heavy. He turned it over in his hands, felt the weight of it, then opened the unsealed flap and drew out the contents. He spread them across the desk slowly and methodically. Bank statements going back 3 years, from accounts he had never seen referenced in any estate paperwork. Property transfer deeds for 3 parcels of land, each stamped with a recording date that fell within the first 60 days after Walter's death. Fast, he noted, moving fast. A letter on financial firm letterhead from Helena, dated 18 months ago, referencing a portfolio review and alluding, in careful professional language, to discrepancies in the recorded asset transfers that had not been satisfactorily resolved. And beneath all of it, held together with a single metal clip, a will. He recognized the format immediately. He had seen a copy of Walter's will during the weeks following the funeral. A standard document, formal and clean, leaving the estate primarily to Patricia with modest provisions for Lauren. A document everyone had accepted without question, because there had seemed to be no reason not to, and because Patricia had moved through the process so smoothly and efficiently that questioning it would have felt like an insult to a grieving widow. This document had the same letterhead, the same legal language, but the date was 14 months earlier than the version that had gone through probate, and the terms were completely different. He read it once, quickly. Then he set it down and read it again, more slowly, not because he had missed anything, but because he needed to let it settle. The estate, the properties, the managed accounts, the majority of what Walter had spent his life building, was to pass into a trust established for Macy's benefit, to be administered until she turned 25. Trent was named as trustee and estate guardian. Lauren received a modest living provision sufficient for her basic needs. Patricia received her personal property and the family home she had been living in for 30 years. Nothing more. Walter had known something. He had not said it to anyone, as far as Trent could tell. He was not a man who aired his concerns or made announcements. But he had seen something in the women who lived closest to him, something he had decided he could not leave unaddressed, and had done the only thing available to him. He had written it down, signed it in front of witnesses, and left it to the law to carry. Trent stood in that room for a long moment, holding the will in both hands. He let out a short, dry sound, not quite a laugh, but related to one. The sound of understanding arriving late, of pieces that had been scattered across years suddenly settling into a shape that seemed, now, to have been obvious all along. Patricia hadn't brought her daughter and her grandchild's father's absence and all her careful logistics to bear on the Bahamas trip because she needed a vacation. She had come to this office to finish what she had started in the weeks after Walter died, to make sure that every piece of paper that could undo what she had done was gone. And she had found everything she was looking for except this. This she had left behind. He looked toward the doorway. Macy had already gone. He stacked the documents carefully, returned them to the envelope, and tucked it under his arm. He turned off the office light, walked to the kitchen, and sat down at the table. He took out his phone. The attorney he called had handled a property boundary dispute for him 3 years ago and was known around Bozeman as someone who did not get excited or verbose unless the situation required it. When Trent laid out what he was looking at, briefly, specifically, without editorializing, there was a silence on the line that lasted a full 5 seconds. "Don't touch anything else in that room," the man said. "Don't photograph anything and don't send it anywhere. Bring the whole envelope in at 8 tomorrow morning." "I'll be there," Trent said. He hung up, put the envelope on the counter where he could see it, went down the hall to sit with Macy until she fell asleep, which didn't take long. She was out within 10 minutes, curled on her side under a blanket he had retrieved from the linen closet, a real one this time, heavy and warm. He sat in the chair beside her bed and listened to her breathe and let the full weight of the evening rest on him without pushing it away. She had been alone for 3 days. She had run out of food, and she had not called anyone because she had not wanted to be a problem. She had waited. He was going to make sure she never had to wait like that again. Caleb Rourke's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Main Street that had outlasted 3 separate renovation waves in that part of downtown without changing much about itself. The carpet was old and the furniture was solid, and the man behind the desk looked like he had been constructed for exactly this kind of room. Broad across the shoulders, unhurried, with a listening quality about him that made you feel as if every word you said was being accurately filed rather than merely heard. He read through the documents for a long time without speaking. Trent sat across from him and let the silence work. Outside the window, Bozeman's morning traffic moved through the slushy streets below. The slow, careful movement of a city that was accustomed to winter and had made its peace with it. He had left Macy with Dot Farrell 2 doors down, a retired schoolteacher who had known Macy since infancy and who had opened her door that morning, looked at Trent for exactly 2 seconds, and said, "She'll be fine. Go. No questions. No further discussion." Caleb set the last page down. He placed his hands flat on the desk surface and looked across at Trent. "This is real," he said. "Not a draft. Not a preliminary. Properly executed, valid signatures, valid notarization. And the date on it predates the version that went through probate by 14 months. He tapped the edge of one of the property transfer deeds. These filings happened fast, within 60 days of Walter's death. In my experience, that's not how an estate settles naturally. That's how it settles when someone is moving deliberately. He picked up the bank statements, and these account movements were never reported to the probate court. "Is the will they submitted forged?" Trent asked. "That's for a forensic document examiner to determine, and we will retain one. What I can tell you right now is that the document you brought me is legitimate, and the combination of a hidden original will, unreported asset transfers, and the filing speed on these deeds is already enough to open a serious estate fraud investigation against your mother-in-law." Trent nodded once. "And Lauren?" Caleb leaned back and turned a pen in his fingers. "She signed 3 of the 9 transfer deeds. 3 separate dates, spread across 6 weeks. Either she understood precisely what she was putting her name to, or she allowed her mother to manage her hand without asking enough questions." He set the pen down. "Courts have seen both versions of that story, and I'll be honest with you. The distinction matters less than you might expect when there's a signed instrument with your wife's signature on it. What matters is the outcome, and the outcome is documented. Then there's the matter of Macy," Trent said. Caleb's manner shifted slightly, not softer, but more deliberate, the way a man moves when he is choosing his language with care. "I need everything documented. Medical examination today. Not this afternoon, this morning. I want a pediatrician's report in hand. I want photographs of the house as you found it. Any security camera footage that establishes the timeline of who came and went and when. Phone records that confirm your wife knew your return date. He opened a fresh notepad. If you can build that package, I can file for emergency temporary custody by the end of the week. That means Lauren cannot remove Macy from the county without a court order while the hearing is pending. And the financial case runs alongside it, Trent said. Parallel tracks. The child endangerment case is faster and cleaner. The fraud case is bigger. Together, they make each other stronger. Trent looked at the documents spread across the desk. Walter's careful handwriting on the original will, the notary stamp, Lauren's neat signature on the transfer deeds. All of it patient and quiet and waiting. File everything, he said. He worked through that week with the same focused precision he brought to pipeline jobs. No shortcuts, no steps skipped, every piece of information documented before the next piece was started. On the first full morning, he took Macy to Dr. Ellen Foss, who had been their family pediatrician since Macy was a toddler. Ellen was thorough and unhurried, and when Trent explained what had happened in plain, factual terms, she conducted a complete assessment without comment. She noted the mild dehydration, the weight reading that was down from Macy's last visit 3 months prior, and an elevated resting heart rate consistent with physical and emotional stress. She completed her written report and had it ready by 4 that afternoon. That evening, Trent sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and pulled the security camera footage from the cloud account it automatically uploaded to. He went through the files frame by frame. Lauren's car left the driveway at 10:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. After that, nothing. 3 days of footage with no vehicle returning, no figure at the front door, nothing passing through the camera's field except wind and blowing snow. The timestamp ran clean and unbroken. He printed the summary and the key still frames. Then he pulled their last full text exchange, going back 2 weeks. The message in which he had written 2 more weeks at least carried a red receipt. Lauren had seen it the morning it arrived. The follow-up message, in which he had mentioned possibly finishing early, but said he couldn't commit to a date, was more ambiguous. But the first one, the clear one, was there. She had read it, and she had known. He put everything into a folder on the kitchen counter and started a second one the next day. The bigger piece came on the 4th day. Caleb had spent the first 2 days of the week working his network of contacts, a quiet, deliberate process of calls and outreach that Trent was not privy to in real time, but that produced results. One of those calls reached a man named Douglas Hart, who had served as Walter Dune's personal financial advisor for 11 years before Walter's death and was retired now in Billings. He answered the phone on the second ring. Caleb gave Trent the summary that same evening in the same office. "He's willing to testify," Caleb said. "He told me that approximately 2 months before Walter died, Patricia came to him and asked about restructuring certain accounts so that they would transfer automatically to her on his death, bypassing the will entirely. He declined. He thought that was the end of it." He paused. After Walter died, Douglas attended the estate proceedings out of respect. He sat in that room, and he saw the will they presented to the court, and he knew immediately that it was not the document Walter had shown him and discussed with him in detail. But he told himself he was misremembering. He said he wasn't certain enough to cause trouble for a grieving family. "But now he is," Trent said. "Now he is." Caleb opened a folder. He kept copies of the session notes Walter sent him after every meeting. Walter had a habit of sending written confirmations after every significant conversation, 11 years of them. They discuss the will explicitly. They discuss Patricia's approach to him. They discuss Walter's decision to restructure the estate in Macy's favor and his reasons for it, which he apparently laid out in writing with considerable clarity. Caleb looked at Trent. Walter knew what Patricia was likely to do after he was gone. He built as much of a paper trail as he could. He just wasn't able to make sure the right document survived. Trent thought about Walter for a moment. He had never been particularly close with the man. Walter was contained and formal, the kind of person who kept his internal life well behind the perimeter of what he was willing to say in company. But he had paid attention. He had watched the people closest to him with the patient, private attention of someone who was taking stock. And when he had seen enough, he had done the only thing within his power. He had written it down. He had made it legal. and he had trusted that the paper would outlast the deception surrounding it. He had been right, just not in the way he had probably planned. Lauren signed 3 of the transfer deeds, Trent said. 3 of 9 across 6 weeks. Hart's testimony doesn't address Lauren's specific knowledge. Patricia ran the executor function, and Lauren wasn't always present for the transactional work. But the signatures are there, and the dates establish a pattern. It wasn't a single momentary confusion. Then we have everything, Trent said. Caleb looked at him across the desk. We have more than enough. He waited until all of it was confirmed and secured. The medical report, the camera footage, printed and annotated. The real will, now with Caleb's office, and submitted to the forensic examiner, whose preliminary finding had come back in 48 hours. The document was genuine, and the signatures matched Walter's verified handwriting from multiple independent reference samples. Douglas Hart's signed affidavit, the property deeds with their dates, the bank records, the full text message history, all of it in order, cross-referenced, and on file. Then he called Lauren. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Her voice had the easy warmth of someone who was somewhere beautiful and warm and had not yet been required to account for anything. He could hear ambient sound behind her, light wind, distant conversation, something open and southern. Hey, we're still here. Honestly, this place has been incredible. You wouldn't believe you left Macy alone. He said it flat, not with force, not raised. Stated, the way you state a measurement or a temperature, a thing that simply is. A pause, brief. Then, oh God, is she okay? I thought Mom had arranged everything with Mrs. Cartwright. She said it was confirmed. She called her personally. Nobody came. 3 days. I have the security footage. No vehicle entered the property after you left. Trent, that's not. I have Macy's medical report. She was dehydrated. She ran out of cereal on the 2nd day, and she was drinking water. She told me she didn't call anyone because she didn't want to be a problem. He let that sit for a moment. She's 8 years old. The silence this time was different. The first pause had been the pause of surprise. This was the silence of someone who has heard something they cannot reframe and knows it. I didn't know it was that bad. Her voice had dropped, gone careful, gone deliberate. You know how Mom is. She says something is handled, and I believe it's handled. That's how it's always worked. She has never let something fall through that badly before. I had no reason to think. I know, Trent said. A brief pause. I would never have left if I found Walter's real will. The silence this time was complete. Not a pause, a total stillness. He could hear the ambient warmth of wherever she was in that silence. The faint outdoor sound still running in the background, and then none of it registered because the silence on her end had taken up all available space. Then Patricia's voice in the background. Close, sharp and controlled. What did he say? Lauren's voice, almost inaudible. Nothing. Just hold on, don't, Trent said quietly. Don't manage it right now. The documents are already with the court. The forensic examiner has confirmed the original will. Douglas Hart has signed a statement. He paused. You'll both want to come home soon. Trent, please, he ended the call. He set the phone on the kitchen table and sat back in his chair and stayed there for a while without moving. The house was quiet around him. Down the hall, he could hear the soft, ordinary sounds of Macy in her room. A drawer opening, something being set down, the small domestic soundtrack of an 8-year-old going about her evening. She had been sleeping well this week. The first morning after he came home and restocked the kitchen properly, she had opened the refrigerator, stood, and looked at it for a long, silent moment, and then closed it and walked to the table and sat down for breakfast without saying a word. She had eaten 2 full helpings and not left a single thing on her plate. He thought about what was coming. The courtroom. Lauren's tears, which he had already factored into his thinking. He knew the particular way she moved through confrontation, the instinct she had always had to find the angle of greatest softness and inhabit it fully. Patricia's composure, which would hold as long as it could, and then wouldn't. The story they had probably begun constructing the moment he hung up. He felt none of what he might have expected to feel. No nervousness. No anticipatory grief for the marriage, which had been failing in quiet ways for years. No anger that needed managing. He felt clear. He felt the specific, grounded steadiness of a man who has done every part of the preparation correctly and is now simply waiting for the process to complete. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, went down the hall to say good night to his daughter. The Gallatin County Courthouse sat 2 blocks from Main Street, pale-bricked and functional, the kind of building that makes no claim to grandeur but accumulates weight through the sheer volume of what has been decided inside it over the years. The morning was cold and the sky was a hard, washed-out blue above the snow-covered rooflines. Trent arrived 20 minutes early. He walked the block once before going in, an old habit from years of construction and pipeline work, the habit of walking a space before you commit to it, understanding the physical reality of a place before the work begins. Then he went through the doors, nodded to the court officer, and found the right room. He chose a seat near the back wall, despite Caleb's earlier suggestion about positioning. He wanted to watch the room fill. He had not slept particularly well in the days leading up to this morning, but it was not the kind of sleeplessness that comes from anxiety. It was more like the sleeplessness of someone who has work that is still running through his mind, not because he is uncertain about it, but because his mind was doing what trained minds do, running checks, going over the sequence, making sure nothing was left in an uncertain state. He had woken early each morning this week, had lain in the dark for a few minutes, and had been unable to find anything he had missed or left undone. That, in itself, was its own kind of reassurance. He thought about Macy briefly. She was at school. He had dropped her off that morning, and she had climbed out of the truck and collected her backpack and turned to look at him through the open window with the expression she sometimes had, watchful, assessing, older than she should need to be. "It's today, right?" she had said. Yes. She had looked at him for a moment more. Then she had said, "Okay," and walked through the school doors without looking back. And he had sat there for a moment watching the doors close behind her before pulling away from the curb. It filled steadily over the next 20 minutes. He recognized a handful of faces, old neighbors, people who had known Walter through his land dealings, a woman from Macy's school who had heard something through someone else. They took their seats and spoke in low voices and directed careful, neutral glances toward the front of the room with the particular expression of people who have already formed opinions they are being appropriately polite about not displaying. Lauren came in through the side door with her attorney, a sharp-dressed man whose leather portfolio and measured stride communicated professional competence clearly enough. Lauren was dressed simply, in pale blue, without jewelry, her hair pulled back in a way that was clearly considered and deliberate in its simplicity. She moved slowly across the room, and her eyes were already red at the rims. She sat at the defense table, folded her hands flat on the surface, and kept her gaze down. Patricia entered 2 minutes later. She walked the way she always walked into any room she expected to have authority over. Chin up, pace measured, the unhurried movement of a person who has always been the one setting the terms of any space she entered. But Trent read her in the first 3 seconds. A tightness around the eyes that was not grief, but active suppression, a jaw held 1 degree too deliberately, a stillness in the hands that was not relaxation, but its opposite. She sat beside Lauren and leaned in and said something brief and low, and Lauren gave a small, barely perceptible nod without looking up. The confidence was still present, but it was being managed now rather than simply felt. That was new. Caleb was at his table, arranging documents with the calm focus of someone who finds nothing dramatic about what he is doing, because he has done this many times and the drama is not the point. The judge entered and the room came to order. Lauren's attorney opened with a well-constructed frame. He was measured and sympathetic in the way good attorneys are. He acknowledged the facts that could not be denied and built a careful emotional shelter around his client using the ones that could be shaped. He talked about the extended absences, the pipeline contracts, the pattern of a marriage in which one partner carried the weight of daily life while the other worked across state lines. He described his client as someone who had relied heavily on her family network in the absence of a present partner, and who had made the misjudgment of trusting a family member's assurances about an arrangement she had believed was in place. It was not a bad argument. Trent gave him that. Lauren took the stand and had composed herself with care. Her voice was controlled, but carried a precise degree of fragility. Not weak, but vulnerable in the specific way that invites sympathy before scrutiny. She spoke about the years of the marriage with the fluency of someone who had been rehearsing the narrative. She described the loneliness of a Montana winter with a young child and a husband 3 states away. She described her mother as the constant, the presence who had helped manage the household, attended the school events, been there during the nights. Macy was sick and Lauren was stretched too thin to manage it alone. "My mother has been there for everything that mattered," she said quietly. "When I needed help, she was the one who showed up. I trusted her because she had never once given me a reason not to." When she said the neighbor was confirmed to check on Macy, I believed it completely. I want this court to understand that I would never in my life leave my daughter without knowing she was cared for. She held a pause, looked at her hands. Then she looked across the room directly at Trent. Her face shifted, a small, controlled erosion at the corners of her mouth, the kind of expression that arrives when someone has real feeling to lean into and chooses to lean. There was genuine grief in it, the grief of a person watching a situation reach an endpoint they had somehow failed to prevent even as they created it. "My husband has built a case against our family," she said. Her voice was low and even. "He wants to take my daughter away from me. But I have never, not one day of her life, stopped loving that little girl. Not for 1 hour." The room absorbed it. He could feel the slight, collective adjustment, people recalibrating, weighing what they had just heard against what they already thought they knew. The particular breath-holding that happens when one version of a story is presented well enough to create real uncertainty about the other one. Trent sat with his hands folded in his lap and his face neutral. He did not look at the people in the seats behind him. He did not react. He had expected every note of this, every calibration. He had watched Lauren move through difficult conversations for 11 years, and the instinct was always the same. Find the position of greatest softness, inhabit it fully, redirect the narrative toward her own experience until the other person starts wondering if the problem is actually themselves. She was not lying in the simple sense of fabricating things that hadn't happened. She was arranging what had happened so carefully that the most important parts became invisible. It almost worked. He could feel the moment when it almost worked. Then Caleb stood. He did not raise his voice. He moved through the evidence with the unhurried patience of a man who has learned that facts do not require performance. They require order, clarity, and the patience to present them without getting in their way. He started with the abandonment. He produced the security camera summary, a printed timeline with still-frame captures attached, showing Lauren's vehicle leaving the driveway at 10:47 a.m. on a Tuesday and not returning for 5.5 days. He walked the judge through each frame: the empty driveway, the unbroken snow surface, the absence of any movement at the door across 3 full days. He presented Dr. Foss's written report: mild dehydration, below baseline weight, elevated heart rate, and the physician's documented opinion that the child had gone without adequate nutrition for a minimum of 40 to 48 hours. He noted the medical findings were consistent with the child's own account that she had been without food for over a day. He read Lauren's note into the record. Flat, word for word. "We needed a break. Macy's fine. You'll be back soon anyway." He let the words sit in the air for a moment before he moved on. The way you let something rest after you've set it down so that people understand you're not rushing past it. Then he moved to the financial record. He placed the authenticated original will on the table, confirmed by 2 independent forensic document examiners as predating the version submitted to probate by 14 months. He walked the judge through the property transfer deeds one by one, identifying Lauren's signature on 3 of them, noting the dates and the 6-week interval across which they had been signed. He produced the bank statements and traced the flow of assets in clean, sequential terms, where the money had originated, where it had moved, and the fact that none of those movements had appeared in the probate court filing. Then he placed Douglas Hart's affidavit on the table. He summarized it in plain language. Walter Dune had revised his estate plan deliberately and documented the reasons for doing so. His wife had attempted to redirect those plans before his death, had been refused, and had proceeded through different means after his death. The will submitted to probate did not reflect Walter's actual intentions as documented across 11 years of detailed advisor correspondence. The original had been concealed. The room had gone genuinely still. Lauren's face had been changing since the moment Caleb stood, a slow process of erosion. Not a single crack, but a gradual settling, the way something fails when the structure beneath it is undermined piece by piece. By the time Caleb laid down the affidavit, she was no longer looking at the judge. She was staring at the table in front of her, and her attorney was still beside her, and Patricia, across the room, had gone to somewhere beyond the reach of what was happening in it. Her spine was straight. Her face was locked, but the confidence was gone from behind her eyes, replaced by something that looked less like composure and more like the absence of available options. "I didn't understand what I was signing," Lauren said. It came out low, directed at the table rather than the room. The statement of someone who needs to say something, even if no one responds. Caleb looked across at her, not unkindly, but without any yielding in his manner. "You signed 3 separate instruments," he said quietly, "on 3 separate dates, each more than a month apart. Each document contained a summary of its purpose on the first page. In plain language." He held one of the deeds up briefly. "You understood enough." The judge had not reacted throughout. She had the complete attention of someone who processes deeply and does not broadcast the processing. Caleb paused, and Trent recognized the quality of that pause. They had talked about this in the office the day before, and this was the pause that came just before the last thing. "Your Honor," Caleb said, "I'd like to present one final piece of evidence." The court officer brought a laptop around and positioned it toward the bench. The room shifted forward by a degree. Trent had installed the indoor camera about 8 months ago, tucked up behind the books on the highest shelf of the living room after he noticed that small things had been disappearing from the house. A watch he couldn't find, some cash from the bureau, a bracelet of Macy's that turned up later in an odd drawer. The camera had never captured anything useful for that particular concern. He had largely stopped thinking about it, until the night he came home and walked through every room in the house methodically and remembered that the cloud account was still running. He had sat at the kitchen table that first night with his laptop, going through weeks of automated uploads. Most of it was nothing. Macy watching television by herself. Macy eating cereal at the coffee table in the early afternoon, feet dangling. Trent had felt a quiet, heavy ache watching that. Her alone in the living room, eating cereal at the coffee table, the house empty around her, and he had set it aside and kept going through the files. And then he had found a one dated 3 days before the trip. The footage was captured from above and to the side in the slight fisheye perspective of indoor cameras, the audio coming through a small built-in microphone that caught the room with enough clarity to be useful. The image was lit by the flat afternoon light coming through the living room windows. Patricia stood near the center of the room, hands clasped in front of her in the way she always held herself when she was delivering a verdict. Lauren sat on the edge of the sofa, arms crossed, her gaze somewhere toward the window rather than at her mother. The court officer pressed play. Patricia's voice came through the speaker, clear and unhurried. "She'll be fine." A pause. Then Lauren, quieter. "And if something happens?" A beat. Patricia, turning slightly toward the window. "Then her father deals with it. That's his job." The room went completely still. Not the managed procedural stillness of a courtroom in session. Something real, something that arrived in the room and occupied it entirely. The particular silence that descends when the last remaining frame of a story collapses and the only thing left is what was always true, now spoken plainly in the person's own voice, recorded in their own home, while their daughter sat 2 feet away and nodded and said nothing. Lauren's hands came up and covered her face. Patricia did not move. She stared at the wall to her left, jaw set, eyes fixed on a point outside the room. Whatever was happening behind that face, she had spent too many decades behind that wall to let it out now. She gave it nothing. She sat inside her composure the way a person sits inside a structure they know has been compromised, but will not leave until they are required to. Lauren's attorney leaned toward her and said something low. She did not acknowledge it. Caleb gathered his papers and sat down. Trent looked straight ahead and said nothing. The judge took 20 minutes. When she returned, she moved through the rulings with the precise, unhurried manner of someone who has already made the decisions and is now simply stating them. On the matter of custody, immediate and full transfer to Trent Holloway, effective at the close of proceedings. Lauren Holloway's access to the minor child was placed under supervised conditions pending the resolution of the pending criminal charges. On the matter of the marriage, the divorce petition already on file was granted. The court recommended mediation only in matters relating to the child's formal custody schedule and only following the resolution of the criminal proceedings. On the financial matter, all identified documents were referred to the district attorney's office and the county probate court for a full estate review. The assets identified as improperly transferred were to be frozen pending that review. The court's preliminary findings stated that significant fraud had likely occurred and referred both Patricia Doon and Lauren Holloway for formal criminal charges: estate fraud, falsification of legal documents, and procedural deception of the probate court. The child endangerment charges, filed the previous week through County Child Protective Services, were confirmed and entered to both women's records. The court officer moved first to Patricia. She stood when required. She held her wrists steady and submitted to the process with the formal, deliberate stillness of someone performing composure as a final act of self-definition. No outburst, no argument, no expression directed at anyone in the room. She walked out with her spine straight and her eyes forward, her face a closed door. She did not look at Trent. She did not look at Lauren. If there was something collapsing behind those eyes, she had spent too many years behind that particular wall to let it out now, and she was not going to let it out here. Lauren was different. When the court officer approached her table, she was already coming apart. She rose unsteadily, one hand briefly on the table's edge, and she turned toward the room and found Trent across it. He held her gaze without flinching and without expression. He gave her nothing, not cruelty, which would have cost him something, and not softness, which she had not earned. He simply looked at her the way you look at the result of a series of choices that belong entirely to someone else. "Please," she said. The word came out stripped of context, directed at no one. Just the word itself, loose in the air, looking for something to land on. She was still talking as the officer led her through the side door, still reaching for the version of the story in which she was the one who needed to be understood, still explaining the way she had always explained, not lying exactly, but arranging, searching for the angle of the narrative that would turn this into something she could survive. The door closed. Her voice stopped. The room exhaled. Caleb came to stand beside Trent, and they walked out together without hurrying. The afternoon outside was cold and sharp and very quiet. The sky the luminous pale gray of a late winter Montana afternoon. Traffic moved along the block below. A snow plow turned at the far corner and ground its way up the street. "Estate transfer hearing in about 6 weeks," Caleb said. "Should be straightforward, given the record at this point." "Good," Trent said. Caleb glanced at him. "You doing all right?" Trent thought about it honestly. "Yeah," he said. "I am." They shook hands. Caleb went back inside. Trent walked to his truck, started the engine, and drove home. He stopped at the grocery store on the way. He filled a cart without a list, working from memory. The things Macy liked, the things that had been absent from that refrigerator when he came home. He was deliberate and unhurried about it, the way he was deliberate and unhurried about most things. A man who had just come from a courtroom where the last chapter of a very long and damaging situation had been formally closed, buying groceries, because dinner still needed to happen. Because the ordinary things did not pause for the extraordinary ones, and he had always found more comfort in the ordinary things anyway. He thought about the call he would need to make to Macy to tell her he was on his way home. She was at Dot's again today. He had explained enough to Dot without explaining everything, and Dot had understood enough without needing everything. That was the specific social intelligence of a woman who had spent 30 years teaching children. The ability to read a room accurately and respond to what was actually needed rather than what was technically asked. He thought about what came next. The estate proceedings. Caleb's 6-week timeline. The matter of Macy's life going forward. her schooling, her stability, the gradual process of a child who has absorbed a significant disruption, working her way through it at her own pace. He was not a man who needed to plan everything, but he was a man who needed to know where the next step landed before he put his weight on it. And the next step was clear: home, dinner, tomorrow morning. The day after that, he loaded the groceries into the truck and drove home through the last of the winter afternoon. Weeks passed. The criminal proceedings moved at the pace they always moved when the evidence was extensive and well-documented, methodically, without drama, through a series of hearings and procedural steps that Caleb handled and summarized for Trent in brief weekly calls. Patricia's attorney filed motions that came to nothing. Lauren's attorney negotiated terms. Trent was informed of the outcomes and signed the necessary documents and did not attend any of the subsequent hearings. He had been present for the part that mattered. The estate hearing came in 6 weeks, as Caleb had predicted. The frozen assets were formally transferred into the trust. Macy's name was entered into the legal record as the principal beneficiary of her grandfather's real intention, the one he had documented carefully and trusted to survive, and it had, in the end, done exactly that. Walter's final act of care for his granddaughter had been validated in the same building where it had been undone, and there was something fitting about that, Trent thought, even if fitting was not the same as easy. He focused instead on the house. He shoveled the driveway every morning before Macy woke up, which became its own kind of ritual without his planning it that way. The early dark, the cold air, the clean sound of the shovel, the quiet street before the day had properly started. He repainted the kitchen on a Saturday, the two of them at it with rollers, Macy in an old t-shirt, achieving considerably more paint on herself than the wall and treating each drip as a significant accomplishment. He fixed the heater vent in her bedroom that had been rattling and only half functioning for a year. He repaired the back gate. He replaced the broken shelf bracket in the hallway closet that he had been meaning to fix since March. He worked through the house systematically the way he worked through any job. Not in a rush, but steadily, each thing handled properly before moving to the next. Macy, for her part, had come back to herself gradually and completely. She ate well. She slept through the night without the broken, light sleep of the weeks before. She started reporting on things at school again. Small things, the way children do, the kind of detail that means nothing to an adult and everything to the person telling it. She had a friend named Petra who apparently had very strong opinions about which lunch table belonged to whom. She was reading a book about wolves. She had decided, without announcing it, that the decorative blanket she had spent 3 days huddled under was not good enough for actual use, and had dragged it to the donate box in the hallway with the expression of someone handling unfinished business. Trent had not said anything. He had just added a second blanket to her closet shelf. He replaced the living room lamp, the way home light. He took it down and put it in a box in the garage, and he and Macy drove to the hardware store on a Thursday afternoon and stood in front of a display of floor and table lamps for the better part of 3 minutes. She had moved methodically along the row, reaching out to touch each one in sequence, considering each with the focused expression she brought to decisions she took seriously. "I like this one," she said, pulling a lamp with a green ceramic base toward her. She said it simply and without hedging, the way she said most things, as if the matter were settled the moment she said it, which it was. He carried it to the register, and they drove home and set it up before dinner, and it sat on the side table in the living room and burned warm and steady, and neither of them mentioned where the previous lamp had been or why it was gone. On a Tuesday evening in late February, Trent was finishing the dishes when Macy came in and spread her homework across the kitchen table. She settled into it with the focused, private concentration she brought to anything she considered worth her attention. Pencil moving, 1 foot tucked under her on the chair, eraser occasionally enlisted. The kitchen was warm. The light above the table was steady. Outside the window, the February evening had come in dark and quiet. He turned off the tap, dried his hands, sat down across from her. She looked up. "Dad, yeah." She turned her pencil in her fingers, the way she always did when she was deciding whether to say something. "Are they in jail?" He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "They are." She considered that, looked back down at her homework. After a moment, she said, "Okay," and picked up her pencil and went back to work. No further questions. No elaboration. No performance of feeling. Just a small person who had received the information she needed, processed it, and moved on. The way people move on when the thing they feared most has been named and placed and made to take its actual size rather than the enormous, shapeless size it had while it was still unnamed. Trent sat there and watched her. The kitchen was warm around them. The light was steady. Outside, the last of the winter dark had settled in, and the snow on the back steps caught the porch light and turned its soft gold along the edges. Somewhere down the street, a car moved slowly through the quiet and was gone. He thought about what they had believed, the two of them, each in her own way, both formed by the same long-standing assumption that the world could be managed if you moved quickly enough and controlled enough of the available information. They had believed that a man who worked pipeline jobs in another state and came home tired from it would not look closely. That a man who had spent years choosing not to start fights would go on choosing that. That documents could be buried and timelines could be obscured and a child could be left in a cold house and lives could be rearranged in someone else's favor if you acted before anyone had time to organize a response. They had underestimated Walter, who had seen what was coming and written everything down and trusted it to survive him. They had underestimated Macy, who had found the envelope in the quiet of an empty house and held it carefully and waited for her father to come home. And they had underestimated Trent, who had arrived 3 days early in the dark and the snow, and who had understood within 20 minutes of walking through that door exactly what had been done and exactly what he was going to do about it. Not with anger, not with noise, with the same precision and patience he brought to any job that mattered. The kind of work where getting it right the first time is the only acceptable outcome. They had counted on speed, on secrecy, on the assumption that nobody would look closely enough. They had been wrong about all of it, and they had paid for it, and they would keep paying for it, and that was no longer Trent's concern. Macy stacked her homework and said, "Can we watch something before bed?" He said yes. They went to the living room together and settled on the couch. Macy under the heavy blanket, the good one, her socked feet tucked under her, the green-based lamp burning warm and steady on the table beside them. The television came on, and the room filled with its quiet, ordinary light. The house held them the way a good house should, without effort, without drama, without requiring anything from either of them except to be in it. Outside, the winter went on, but inside it was warm, and that was enough.